My simple question is your interpretation of the Act as it stands today, whether there's any scope of providing that protection at all, or whether the Act has to be amended, because then that becomes a legislative matter. But before I ask you that question, let's try and find out what exactly happened in court today. Ashmit is joining in. Ashmit, fill us in.
Right, so as has been painted out, the Delhi High Court has made it abundantly clear that as far as this particular case is concerned, the RBI's objections have been set aside. Now, we, of course, have to go into the details of the order, which is not yet out. We'll have to see whether this is an exemption made specifically in case of the Tata-Docomo case, or whether it's a more widespread order that affects all other transactions where we have a put option available, where we have an exit clause available. We'll still have to go into the merits of that. We'll have to go into what the Delhi High Court's reasoning is. Of course, before we move further, important to point out that this is an order passed by a single judge bench of the Delhi High Court, which means there are two levels of appeal still left. The RBI has the option of one, appealing before a division bench of the same Delhi High Court, and then subsequently, depending on the results there, the aggrieved party would have then the option of moving the apex court. So two layers of appeal are still available. We spoke to the RBI counsel. The counsel at this point is refraining from giving any statement, but at the same time has stated that the RBI will look at this judgment. They are still looking for the fine print. They are waiting the fine print just as we are on what the repercussions of the order could be. But as far as this particular transaction is concerned, the Delhi High Court, by rejecting the RBI's concerns and by taking on board the consent terms filed by the parties, has cleared the decks for the payout of $1.17 billion. Of course,
didn't give any reason, Ashmit. All you have is the judgment.
Well, at this point, as is the convention in the Delhi High Court, as well as most other high courts, they deal in this as a part of pronouncing the judgment. They deal only with the operative part of the order. But given that the judgment has been passed, it's only a matter of hours before we get the final copy of the order, which will have more details.
Okay, Ashmit, thanks so much for that. Mr. Raneena and Mr. Khan, if I could go back to the question that I was just trying to ask. Very simple. FEMA, as it stands today, does it offer any scope whatsoever of providing some sort of capital protection to a foreign partner, or does this Act need to be amended to provide protection? Mr. Raneena, your interpretation.
My interpretation is that the Act needs to be amended, or even if you don't amend, at least the rules must provide for it and make it very clear exactly in what circumstances this issue can be decided. So there must be clear-cut guidelines, and RBI will have to sit with the government, with the finance ministry, and work out the details and then come up with clear-cut guidelines. That is very important. So we can't wait for FEMA to be amended. That will be only next year, maybe later when Parliament is in session, and that will be long gone. But the rules have to be amended immediately with the permission of the government.
Okay. Mr. Khan, your thoughts?
No, very clearly regulations can be amended very swiftly. There is absolutely no issue. There is no need of amending the FEMA, the law as such. Okay. The regulations provided for these regulations can be amended. In fact, there is a scope for interpretation of capital protection. But to keep things beyond any controversy, it's better to go for a framework which is win-win for both the Indian investees and the foreign investors, and seeking the overall interest of India being an attractive destination for FDI, and that we believe in rule of law. I think we should go for a holistic policy review and put out a framework under the regulation so that there is some protection, and we take cognizance of the changes which is happening in international transactions. We just can't be stuck to what we told 10 years ago.
Okay.
That has moved ahead of us.
Okay.
Mr. Raneena, if I can ask, is there a lack of clarity on one issue? How are they now going to pay if RBI does not appeal against this verdict? Assuming that, how is Tata going to really pay to Docomo? They will have to still comply with FEMA guidelines, and repatriation from India will be difficult. They'll have to figure out ways of doing that.
What is the consent terms? I'm sure the consent terms would have spelled out how they will be paying to Docomo. Maybe they'll be paid from outside India, from some of the Tata Sons assets outside India, whatever. I don't know the terms. But obviously, once the settlement has been approved by the court and RBI and government accepts it, then the terms of the settlement will prevail, and whatever is the mode for payment will then be adopted.
Okay. Well, Mr. Raneena, do you think that, I mean, what according to you should be the best course of action? As you two gentlemen have pointed out, one, the RBI can go for the larger bench in the High Court, or it can go for go to the Supreme Court. Okay, Please hold on, Mr. Ranina. We also have Mr. Kapil Sibal joining us. Mr. Sibal, the Delhi High Court has asked RBI to accept the consent terms and the international arbitration and has rejected its objections to it. Your first thoughts, sir, do you think what we will see is RBI going on appeal, or do you think the best course for the country is for RBI to change regulations?
How can I possibly comment on what the RBI will do? The only thing I can say is that the High Court has rejected their application. The High Court has taken on record the consent terms, and the High Court has issued certain directions. Now, we are not aware of what the directions are. Till the judgment is uploaded on the website, we'll not be able to comment in detail about what the judgment says, in fact. But this broadly is what the judgment is.
Sir, I believe you were representing Docomo in the case. If you could just give us your interpretation right now, does it, I mean, as things stand, the current verdict, does it completely clear the decks for the payout of this $1.1 billion?
How can I possibly say that? Because the High Court has taken the consent terms on record and rejected the RBI's application. What the RBI will do, I cannot comment on. But the High Court heard counsel for the RBI not just on one day, but on several days. So we'll have to see what the judgment really says. Quite frankly, a third party, which is not a party to the arbitration proceedings, can't have any role to play. The RBI's only role is in terms of honoring certain guidelines.
Yeah.
But that question doesn't arise here for the reason that there is a judgment of a court.
Yeah, Mr. Sibal, this
and
was a
once
question.
there's a judgment of a court, then obviously the regulatory authorities have to honor it.
No, Mr. Sibal, the question my colleague was asking, at the moment RBI rules don't allow money to go from the country. Tata cannot pay from its coffers. It has to pay from some international sources.
No, you're completely wrong.
Okay.
Supposing there is a decree that is executed in this court, in an Indian court. How can the RBI say we will not honor the decree?
So RBI will have to change its rules then?
No, it doesn't have to change anything. A decree, supposing a Supreme Court gives an award, do you think the RBI will have to change its rules to honor the award?
Doesn't it have to?
Once there is a judgment of a court, right? Once there is a stamp of a court and an order of a court, no regulatory authority can say, no, I will not honor it.
No,
So it will override the act as well.
Okay, where's the question of overriding the act? It's a decree of a court.
So,
The court says this has to be paid. Supposing there's an award on damages, where is the question of overriding the act?
So, Mr. Sibal, we are not saying that RBI's rules are in contention with what Delhi High Court has allowed. All I'm asking is your consent terms, did it really allow for a payment from outside of India, or did it allow for a payment from inside India, which is not allowed under FEMA guidelines? That's all.
I don't think you're fully appreciating the issue. The manner of payment will be decided by the parties. Right, and once the arbitration award through the consent terms is accepted by the court, then there is no regulatory authority that can say that look, I will not honor it, because there's a difference between an agreement between two private parties for a payout, which is of course subject to FEMA regulations. But once there is a decree of a court, or supposing the Supreme Court gives a judgment in damages against one party, which is an Indian party, and for a foreign entity, the money has to be paid. RBI cannot say that I will not pay the money. So therefore, we'll have to see the judgment, what the judgment sets out, what the judgment says in the context of the consent terms, and then proceed on that basis. At the moment, I don't know the details of the judgment.
On the face of it, doesn't it appear that now RBI has to change its rules?
Again, I don't know what face you're talking about. Because I think that the law says otherwise. As I explained to you, and I will repeat it, if there's an award of damages by the Supreme Court against an Indian entity for payment to a foreign entity, RBI doesn't have to change its rules. It just has to honor the order.
And sir, is that going to be applicable to other pending disputes as well, this particular order, because it is the order of a High Court of the land? Will the RBI have to change its rules for other cases, or will this simply become a precedent and will it sort of apply there as well?
Again, it all depends on the facts of a case. If there's a shareholders agreement which for a predetermined price to be paid out pursuant to a call option or pursuant to an agreement, and that price doesn't reflect the market price, FEMA regulations will apply. If there's a damages or award on damages or a judgment of a court, then none of this is relevant. I think you're asking a hypothetical question which is not relevant for in the context.
So just want to understand one thing, because we were trying to get this interpretation before you joined in, just for the sake of understanding. If a foreign partner is to be provided a certain degree of capital protection, 40%, 50%, whatever percentage of capital they've put into a joint venture via an option, the current FEMA Act, does it allow, within its framework, does it allow for the provision of such a protection?
No, not.
Or does the Act, it doesn't?
If there's an agreement that the shares will have to be bought out by the Indian party at a certain price, which may not reflect the market value at that point in time, certainly FEMA guidelines will come.
Apply. So what you're saying is, in this case, it is because of damages that the court has...
This is an award in damages. By the arbitrator.
So
that's been upheld by the court. So
fair point. Fair point.
So in this case, Mr. Sibal, the verdict is only on the arbitration award and enforcement of that overriding RBI's jurisdiction.
Not question of overriding.
All right, because RBI does not have a jurisdiction overseas.
Supposing in a dispute a court decides that a foreign party is entitled to payment of X, Y, or Z, right? Now the RBI cannot say no, we will not pay because our guidelines don't allow it.
Fair enough.
Supposing the Supreme Court upholds it, can the RBI say no, under the guidelines we won't pay? So that's really not a relevant issue. In the enforcement of ordinary shareholder agreements, if a foreign entity decides that that the Indian entity will have to buy the shares of the foreign entity at a predetermined price.
I take your point. Yeah.
Right? Then the problem arises of FEMA guidelines.
Fair point.
Okay?
Take your point, Mr. Sibal. We got it. It's not a predetermined price that the court has agreed to, but the court has agreed that Docomo should be paid damages. And that interpretation is what the court appears to have upheld. But we will await the final judgment. Surabhi.